I'm Victoria, 29 years old, and 3 months ago I discovered that winning $380 million doesn't automatically fix a lifetime of being unwanted by your own family. My father looked me dead in the eye and called me a disgrace who needed to stop bothering them with my problems. My sister laughed and called me pathetic, always begging for scraps. My mother finished the trio by declaring I was a leech who needed to figure things out alone. I smiled and simply said, "Thank you for failing my test. Where are you watching from today?" Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. But let me take you back to how we got here. Because this story didn't start with lottery numbers. It started in a house that had everything money could buy except love for me. Growing up, our house was the kind that made neighbors slow down when they drove past. Colonial style, perfectly manicured lawn, 3-car garage that actually held 3 cars. My parents, Robert and Linda Chen, had worked hard to build their comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle. Dad was a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company. Mom was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury homes. They traveled to Europe every other year, drove cars they replaced every 3 years, and made sure everyone knew they were doing well. The problem wasn't money. The problem was me. I wasn't the daughter they wanted. My sister Emma was blonde, bubbly, and had this natural charm that made adults light up when she walked into a room. She was 2 years younger, but somehow seemed more mature, more polished, more everything I wasn't. Emma could sweet-talk her way out of any trouble and into any favor. Me? I was too serious, too direct, too unwilling to perform the happy daughter role they wanted. Victoria has always been difficult to connect with, Mom would tell her friends, right in front of me. She's just not very warm. Dad would nod along, adding his favorite line about how I needed to learn to be more grateful for everything they provided. When Emma broke the antique vase in the living room at age 12, it became a story about how accidents happen, and we should be more careful where we place precious things. When I accidentally scratched Dad's car door with my bike at 14, it became a 2-week lecture series about responsibility, respect for other people's property, and how I needed to think before acting. The double standard wasn't subtle. It was painted in neon across every family interaction. Emma got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a lecture about public transportation building character. Emma's college was fully funded, including her gap year in Europe to find herself. I got student loans and a part-time job. Emma's career struggles were met with endless emotional support and financial bailouts. My career successes were met with brief nods and quick subject changes. By the time I graduated college with a degree in accounting and landed a solid job at a regional firm, I had learned to stop expecting recognition. I had learned to stop expecting inclusion. I had learned to stop expecting anything at all. Which is why, when their financial world started crumbling 5 years later, I wasn't surprised that they still didn't see me as someone worth asking for help. The pattern was so ingrained that I barely noticed it anymore. Family dinners where Emma's opinions were asked and mine were assumed. Holiday planning where Emma's preferences mattered and mine were afterthoughts. Emergency phone calls that went to Emma first, then me only if Emma was unavailable. I became the backup daughter, the one you called when the favorite wasn't answering. Victoria's just not as emotionally available, Mom would explain to relatives who occasionally asked why I seemed so distant at family gatherings. The irony was that I had tried for 25 years to be emotionally available, only to have every attempt dismissed or redirected toward Emma. Dad's favorite criticism was that I was too independent. Apparently, wanting to handle my own problems instead of running to them for help meant I was cold. But when I did ask for their advice or support, I was told I should be more self-sufficient. There was no winning combination, so I stopped playing their game. The real education came when I started watching how they treated other people. Dad was charming and generous with his golf buddies, always picking up tabs and offering help with projects. Mom was warm and supportive with her clients, spending hours helping them find their dream homes. They had an unlimited capacity for kindness, just not for me. I started keeping mental notes, not out of bitterness, but out of genuine curiosity. How many times did they remember Emma's work presentations versus mine? How many times did they ask about Emma's dating life versus mine? How many family photos prominently featured Emma while I was cropped to the edge or missing entirely? The count became absurd. So absurd that I started finding it almost funny. If you're going to be systematically excluded by people who claim to love you, you might as well appreciate the thoroughness of their effort. Emma, to her credit, didn't seem to notice the favoritism, or maybe she just accepted it as natural. She was the star, I was the supporting cast, and that was simply how our family operated. She wasn't malicious about it, just completely oblivious to any reality outside her own experience. When she struggled to find a job after college, the entire family mobilized. Dad made calls to his network, Mom drove her to interviews, and I was expected to be available for pep talks and moral support. When I got promoted to senior accountant the same year, the celebration consisted of Dad nodding and saying, "Good for you, honey," before returning to his newspaper. The most telling moment came during Emma's relationship drama with her college boyfriend. Mom spent hours on the phone coaching her through breakup conversations. Dad offered to pay for therapy to help her process the emotional trauma. The entire family treated her heartbreak like a national emergency requiring all hands on deck. When my own relationship ended after 3 years, I got a text from Mom saying, "Sorry to hear about Jake. You'll find someone better." That was it. No follow-up calls, no offers of support, no acknowledgement that I might be struggling too. I learned to grieve privately, celebrate privately, and solve problems privately. Not by choice, but by necessity. They had trained me to be independent by making dependence on them emotionally dangerous. By my late 20s, I had stopped expecting anything different. I attended family events, participated in gift exchanges, and maintained the appearance of normal family relationships while keeping my emotional distance. It was easier than constantly being disappointed. What I didn't realize was that all this emotional training was preparing me for the biggest test of my life. The first crack in their perfect facade appeared when Dad's company started downsizing. He'd been so confident in his position, so secure in his importance, that the layoff notice caught him completely off guard. 22 years with the same company, and suddenly he was cleaning out his office on a Tuesday afternoon. Mom tried to maintain appearances, but real estate sales in our area had slowed significantly. The luxury market she specialized in dried up as people tightened their belts. Their European vacation got canceled. The car replacements got postponed. The restaurant dinners became grocery store meals. I watched it all unfold from my own stable distance. My accounting job wasn't glamorous, but it was recession-proof. People always needed tax work and bookkeeping, especially during tough economic times. I had built a small side practice helping local small businesses, which gave me additional income and job security. While their world was shrinking, mine was quietly expanding. Emma, meanwhile, had never learned to stand on her own feet. At 27, she was still living at home, still expecting their financial support, still treating their diminishing resources like her personal ATM. Her entry-level marketing job barely covered her car payment and shopping habits, let alone independence. The stress started showing in ways they couldn't hide. Dad developed this nervous habit of checking his phone constantly, watching the job search emails that never came. Mom started making comments about temporary setbacks and market adjustments that fooled no one. Emma began complaining about how unfair it was that other people her age could afford their own apartments. None of them ever asked how I was doing financially. None of them considered that I might have insights about managing money during difficult times. None of them thought to include me in their worried family conversations about the future. I was still the outsider, even during their crisis. Have you ever experienced feeling invisible in your own family's struggles? Share your story in the comments below, because you're definitely not alone in this experience. The really telling part was how they handled their changed circumstances. Instead of adjusting their expectations or developing new strategies, they just became angrier. Angry at the economy, angry at Dad's former company, angry at the real estate market, angry at everything except their own financial decisions. Dad started making bitter comments about kids these days, not understanding the value of hard work. Mom complained endlessly about clients who were wasting her time by looking at houses they couldn't afford. Emma developed a sense of entitlement that somehow grew stronger as their ability to fund it weakened. I offered help once, early on, subtle suggestions about budgeting strategies, mentions of small business clients who were hiring, ideas about cost-cutting that wouldn't affect their quality of life. My suggestions were dismissed as not understanding the real situation or oversimplifying complex problems. So I stopped offering. I watched them struggle with choices I could have helped them avoid. I listened to them worry about bills I could have explained how to manage. I saw them make financial mistakes that my professional training could have prevented. But they had taught me not to insert myself where I wasn't wanted. They had trained me to stay in my lane, to remain the distant daughter who didn't understand their real lives. What they didn't know was that I understood much more than they realized. I understood that their crisis revealed something important about who they really were. I understood that even desperation wouldn't change their fundamental view of me as less worthy of consideration than Emma. Most importantly, I understood that I was completely prepared to handle whatever life threw at me without their support, approval, or involvement. I just didn't know yet how thoroughly I would be tested on that understanding. March 15th changed everything. I had stopped at the gas station after work, the same routine I'd followed for 3 years. Buy gas, grab a coffee, and purchase one lottery ticket with the same numbers I'd been playing since college. my birthday, Emma's birthday, and our old house number. Not because I believed in luck, but because it was easier than choosing new numbers every week. The drawing was that night, but I forgot about it entirely. Work had been busy, I'd made dinner, watched Netflix, and fallen asleep on the couch like any other Tuesday. The ticket sat in my purse, forgotten among receipts and lip balm. Thursday morning, I was running late for a client meeting when I remembered to check the numbers while waiting for my coffee to brew. I pulled up the lottery website on my phone, compared the numbers to my ticket, and had to sit down hard on my kitchen chair. All 6 numbers matched. I stared at the screen, then at my ticket, then back at the screen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I checked again, and a 4th time, because winning $380 million seemed like something that happened to other people, not to the family disappointment who ate cereal for dinner and drove a 10-year-old Honda. The reality hit me in waves. First, the numbers. Definitely mine. Then, the amount. More money than I could conceptualize. Then, the implications. Complete freedom from every financial worry I'd ever had, and more freedom than I'd ever imagined possible. I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. For the next 3 hours, I sat in my kitchen alternately laughing and crying. I pulled up bank websites to understand what $380 million actually meant. I researched lottery lawyers and financial advisors. I looked up houses in places I'd always wanted to live. I calculated how much money I could give away and still live comfortably forever. But mostly I thought about my family. My first instinct, despite everything, was to share the news. To finally be the daughter who could solve their problems, who could prove my value, who could earn the acceptance I'd never managed to achieve. I imagined the phone calls, the celebration dinner, the way they'd finally look at me with pride instead of mild disappointment. For about 10 minutes, I let myself believe that money could fix what had always been broken between us. Then reality kicked in. This was the same family who had dismissed my career success, ignored my emotional needs, and treated my presence like an obligation. The same family who had spent 30 years showing me exactly how much my opinions, feelings, and achievements mattered to them. Money wouldn't change the fundamental dynamic. It would just add a new layer of complication. I made coffee, sat back down at my kitchen table, and started planning instead of dreaming. I called the lottery office to understand the claiming process. I researched legal protections for lottery winners. I learned about trusts, privacy shields, and financial management strategies. I did not call my family. Something about that decision felt powerful in a way I hadn't experienced before. For the first time in my life, I had something valuable that was completely mine, and I could choose exactly how to handle it. I could choose who to trust with the information. I could choose when and how to share it, if I shared it at all. The power of choice felt almost more valuable than the money itself. That weekend, I drove to the lottery office in the state capital and began the process of claiming my prize. I hired lawyers, set up financial structures, and established protections for my identity and my money. Every decision was mine alone, without input from people who had never valued my judgment anyway. For 2 weeks, I lived with the secret. I went to work, had lunch with colleagues, attended my book club, and maintained my normal routine while sitting on the biggest news of my life. The strange thing was how normal everything felt. I was the same person, with the same values and the same daily preferences. The money was just a tool. A very powerful tool, but still just a means to an end. What I needed to figure out was what that end should be. The answer came 3 weeks later, during Sunday family dinner. I hadn't been planning to attend, but Mom had called specifically to ask me to come. "We never see you anymore," she said, though we'd had dinner together 2 weeks earlier. "Emma misses spending time with her big sister." I almost laughed. Emma had my phone number. If she missed me, she knew how to reach me. But I agreed to come, partly out of habit and partly out of curiosity. I wanted to observe them with my new perspective, to see how they operated when they thought nothing had changed. The house felt smaller than I remembered, though nothing had physically changed. Dad looked older, stress showing in the way he held his shoulders. Mom's smile seemed more forced, her cheerfulness a little too bright. Emma appeared frustrated in that particular way of adults who had expected life to be easier than it was turning out to be. Dinner conversation focused on their ongoing struggles. Dad's job search wasn't progressing well. Mom had lost 2 major clients. Emma's car was making strange noises that probably required expensive repairs. The tone was complaints disguised as updates, frustrations presented as temporary setbacks. I listened to it all while eating Mom's pot roast, the same recipe she'd been making for 20 years. The food was exactly the same, but everything else felt different now that I knew I could buy this house 10 times over without affecting my checking account. "How are things with you, Victoria?" Mom asked, and I could tell the question was just politeness. They were too wrapped up in their own problems to genuinely care about my answer. This was my moment. I could have told them everything. I could have solved every problem they'd mentioned in the last hour. I could have finally been the daughter who exceeded their expectations instead of the one who disappointed them. Instead, I heard myself say, "Actually, I'm having some financial stress myself. Nothing major, just having to rethink some spending priorities and maybe tighten my budget." The reaction was immediate and revealing. Dad's face shifted from polite interest to irritation. "Well, maybe if you'd focused on advancing your career instead of just getting comfortable where you are, you'd have more options now." Mom nodded along. "Victoria, you can't expect to coast through life and not feel consequences when things get tough. This is probably a good learning experience for you." Emma actually laughed. "God, Victoria, you're always so dramatic about money. Just cut back on whatever fancy coffee you're buying and you'll be fine." I sat there, watching my family's complete lack of empathy or support, and felt something click into place. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity, crystal clear understanding of who these people really were and how they really felt about me. "I was thinking maybe I should look into cutting some expenses," I said carefully. "Maybe move to a smaller apartment, or think about whether some relationships in my life are worth the investment." "That sounds reasonable," Dad said, already losing interest. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices." "Absolutely," Mom agreed. "It's good that you're being realistic instead of expecting other people to solve your problems." Emma was scrolling through her phone, barely listening. "Yeah, definitely. People who constantly need help are just exhausting." I excused myself to use the bathroom and stood in their guest powder room, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. These people had no idea they were talking to someone who could buy and sell their problems without thinking twice. More importantly, they had just shown me exactly how they respond when they think I need support. With dismissal, with judgment, with the assumption that any struggles I faced were my own fault and my own responsibility to solve. When I returned to the table, they had already moved on to discussing Emma's dating life and Dad's potential networking opportunities. My fictional financial problems had been addressed and dismissed in under 5 minutes. I finished my dinner, helped clear the table, and made polite conversation about nothing important. When I left that night, I hugged them goodbye knowing something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't angry with them. I was grateful. They had just shown me exactly who they were when they thought I needed them. They had failed the easiest test possible, and they had no idea they were even being tested. The next morning, I called my lawyer. "I want to set up a trust structure that completely protects my identity and my assets," I said. "And I want to establish some contingency plans." Over the following weeks, I developed what I privately called the plan. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was more like a comprehensive character assessment of the people who claimed to love me. I started dropping subtle hints about financial pressure. Not dramatic declarations, just casual mentions of reconsidering expenses, maybe scaling back on things, having to be more careful with money. Nothing that would trigger real concern, just enough to see how they'd respond to the suggestion that I might be struggling. The responses were exactly what I expected. Dad offered generic advice about budgeting and responsibility. Mom suggested I look into financial planning courses. Emma made jokes about my spending habits and offered to take my nicer clothes off my hands if I needed to downsize my wardrobe. None of them asked if I needed actual help. None of them offered assistance. None of them showed any genuine concern about my well-being. I documented everything, not formally but mentally. Every dismissive comment, every piece of unhelpful advice, every suggestion that my problems were my own fault. I was building a case, though I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with the evidence. The most telling moment came when Emma called to complain about her car repairs. The estimate was $3,200, more than she had in her checking account. She was stressed, frustrated, and looking for sympathy. "I just don't know how people are supposed to handle unexpected expenses like this," she said. "It's so unfair that one little thing can mess up your whole financial situation." I waited for her to ask if I could help, even though I'd been supposedly struggling myself. I waited for her to offer mutual support, some kind of, "we're both having money troubles, let's figure this out together" conversation. Instead, she said, "You're so lucky your car is reliable. I wish I'd made better choices like you." The irony was spectacular. Emma was praising my practical financial decisions while I sat on $380 million, and she struggled with a $3,200 repair bill. I could have solved her problem with the equivalent of pocket change, but she had never once asked if I needed help with my own supposed financial issues. That night, I finalized my decision. I would continue the charade for a few more months, long enough to gather complete data about their character. I would see exactly how they treated me when they thought I was vulnerable. I would watch how they handled their own problems versus how they responded to mine. And when I had enough information, I would reveal the truth, not as a surprise gift, but as a final exam grade. A comprehensive report on how they had performed as family members when they thought it cost them nothing to be supportive. I suspected they were going to fail dramatically, but I needed to be absolutely certain before I made my final decision about what role, if any, they would play in my new life. The test had begun, and they had no idea they were taking it. But I was already pretty sure I knew how this was going to end. The test accelerated faster than I expected. Within 2 months, my family had shown me everything I needed to know about who they really were when they thought I was vulnerable. It started with the ignored phone calls. I'd call Mom with vague mentions of trying to figure some things out financially, and she'd either let it go to voicemail or cut the conversation short with excuses about being busy with clients. Dad responded to my subtle requests for advice with generic platitudes about budgeting that he clearly copy-pasted from some financial website. But Emma was the real revelation. She called me one evening, stressed about wanting to redecorate her bedroom. Not needing to redecorate, mind you. Wanting to. She'd seen some influencer's room makeover and decided she absolutely had to have those specific throw pillows that cost $200 each. "I know you're going through your whole financial crisis thing," she said, and I could practically hear the air quotes around financial crisis. "But do you think you could spot me like $800? I'll pay you back when I get my tax refund." I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by real estate listings for million-dollar homes I was browsing for fun, and listened to my sister ask me for money while dismissing my supposed financial problems in the same sentence. "I'm really trying to be careful with spending right now," I said carefully. "Oh, come on, Victoria. It's not like you're actually broke. You're just being dramatic like always." Her tone was so dismissive it was almost impressive. "Besides, this is different. This is for something that actually matters." Right. Her throw pillows mattered more than my financial stress. Got it. "I actually can't help with that right now," I said. The silence that followed was telling. Then, "Wow. I mean, I knew you were selfish, but I didn't think you'd gotten this bad. It's $800, Victoria. Not exactly a huge sacrifice for someone with a steady job." This is the same person who, 3 weeks earlier, had told Mom that I probably brought my money problems on myself and that helping me would just enable my poor decision-making. But when she wanted something, suddenly I was selfish for not providing it. After hanging up, I made myself a cup of tea and updated my mental spreadsheet. Emma had failed the empathy test, the consistency test, and the basic human decency test all in one conversation. Impressive efficiency, really. The pattern continued with stunning predictability. Dad mentioned at dinner that people who constantly talk about money problems were just looking for attention. Mom started making comments about how some people never learned to manage stress properly. Emma began telling friends that I was going through a weird phase and being difficult about money. The irony was delicious. Here they were, struggling with actual financial problems, criticizing me for fictional financial problems, while I sat on more money than any of them would see in 10 lifetimes. If this was a comedy, it would be brilliant. Since it was my life, it was just educational. What do you think will happen next when Victoria finally reveals the truth to her family? Drop your predictions in the comments below. 3 months after I'd started my little experiment, I had enough data to write a dissertation on toxic family dynamics. But more importantly, I had absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. I called my lawyer and told him it was time for phase 2. The beautiful thing about having unlimited resources is that you can solve problems before they become problems. I spent the next month building an impenetrable legal fortress around my money and my future. Trust structures that protected my assets from any potential family claims. Legal documentation that established clear boundaries about financial gifts versus loans. Privacy protections that would prevent anyone from accessing my financial information. I even had my lawyer draft template responses for future requests for money because I knew those were coming. While I was building my legal defenses, my family continued their masterclass in conditional love. Mom started making passive-aggressive comments about how some people handle adversity better than others. Dad began telling stories about relatives who'd overcome financial hardship through determination and hard work, with meaningful looks in my direction. Emma escalated to openly mocking what she called my money anxiety, apparently finding my supposed financial stress hilarious. The most revealing incident happened during a family barbecue at my parents' house. I was helping Mom in the kitchen when Emma's friend Sarah mentioned that her company was hiring for a position that would be perfect for someone with my background. "Oh, that's sweet of you to think of, Victoria," Mom said. "But she's going through some kind of financial panic phase right now. Probably not the best time for her to be making career changes." I stood there holding a bowl of potato salad, listening to my mother describe my fake financial problems to a stranger, while completely dismissing a genuine opportunity that could have helped with those problems if they were real. "Actually," Sarah said, looking confused, "the position pays significantly more than typical accounting roles. It seems like exactly what someone with financial concerns would want. Mom waved her hand dismissively. Victoria's always been overly dramatic about money. She'll figure it out eventually. I excused myself to use the bathroom and stood in their hallway, looking at family photos that told the story of 30 years of careful exclusion. There I was, cropped out of vacation pictures, standing slightly apart in group shots, missing entirely from several candid family moments. They had been showing me who I was to them for my entire life. I had just finally learned how to read the message. That evening, I went home and made the call that would end this charade forever. "Hi, Dad. It's Victoria. I was wondering if we could have a family meeting sometime soon. There's something important I need to discuss with everyone. Is everything okay?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Finally, some parental worry. Too bad it was about 3 months too late and based on completely wrong assumptions. "Everything's fine," I said. "Actually, everything's about to be much clearer. How's Sunday afternoon for everyone?" I could practically hear him calculating whether my important discussion would involve asking them for money. Poor Dad. He had no idea he was about to receive the most expensive education of his life. "Sunday works? Should we be worried about this conversation?" I looked around my modest apartment, thinking about the 8-figure bank account that could buy this entire building without affecting my monthly budget. "No, Dad. You shouldn't be worried. You should be prepared to listen very carefully." Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes everything seem more dramatic than it actually is. I drove to my parents' house in my reliable Honda, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents worth more money than they'd ever imagined. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was curious. After 30 years of being treated like the family afterthought, I was finally going to find out what happened when I held all the cards. It felt like the conclusion to a very long experiment in human behavior. Mom had made her famous apple crisp, probably thinking this was going to be one of those difficult family conversations that required comfort food. Dad was pacing in the living room, clearly anxious about what financial disaster I was about to lay at their feet. Emma sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, radiating the particular brand of impatience that comes from being forced to participate in someone else's drama. "So," Dad said once we were all settled, "what's this important thing you needed to discuss?" I opened my portfolio and removed a single document. A letter from the State Lottery Commission, confirming my prize claim. I placed it on the coffee table where all 3 of them could see it. The silence was immediate and complete. Mom leaned forward, squinting at the official letterhead. Dad picked up the document, his hands trembling slightly as he read. Emma's phone slipped from her fingers onto the couch cushions. "This says..." Dad's voice cracked. "This says you won $380 million. "Yes," I said simply. 3 months ago." 3 months? Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "You won this 3 months ago and didn't tell us?" "I was conducting an experiment," I explained, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. "I wanted to see how my family would treat me if they thought I was struggling financially." Emma found her voice first. "Are you fucking kidding me? Language?" "Emma," Mom said automatically, still staring at the lottery document. "No, seriously, are you completely insane?" Emma's face was flushing red. "You've been pretending to have money problems while you're sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars?" I nodded. The results of the experiment were quite illuminating. Dad set the document down with shaking hands. "Victoria, I don't understand. Why would you lie to us about something like this?" "I didn't lie about anything. I said I was having financial stress and needed to reconsider my priorities. That was true. Having $380 million definitely creates stress about financial priorities." I kept my voice level, watching their faces process the information. "What I learned was how you respond when you think I need support." "We would have helped you," Mom protested. "We always help when you really need it." I removed another document from my portfolio, a timeline I'd meticulously prepared, documenting every interaction we'd had over the past 3 months. Every dismissed phone call, every unsympathetic comment, every piece of advice that basically amounted to, "Figure it out yourself." "This suggests otherwise," I said, sliding the timeline across the table. The room fell silent again as they read through my documentation. I watched their faces change as they recognized their own words reflected back at them. The casual dismissals, the lack of empathy, the assumption that my problems were my own fault. "This is..." Dad started, then stopped. "Comprehensive?" I suggested helpfully. "Yes. I'm quite thorough when I set my mind to something." Emma was the first to recover from the shock, and predictably, she went straight to anger. "So what? This is some kind of revenge? You're punishing us for not reading your mind?" "Not revenge," I corrected. "Clarity. I wanted to understand who you really are when you think there's nothing in it for you. Now I know." The aftermath was exactly what I'd expected. Dad tried to argue that they'd been going through their own financial stress and couldn't be expected to support everyone else's problems too. Mom started crying, but it was the frustrated tears of someone who'd been caught rather than the sad tears of someone who felt genuine remorse. Emma oscillated between rage and calculation, clearly trying to figure out how this new information changed her position in the family hierarchy. "So what happens now?" Mom asked, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. I removed the final documents from my portfolio. Legal papers prepared by my attorney, outlining exactly what would happen now. "I'm going to give each of you a one-time financial gift," I said. "Enough to pay off your current debts and provide a modest buffer for emergencies. Dad, your credit cards and the remaining mortgage balance. Mom, the business loan you took out for the real estate license renewal and equipment. Emma, your student loans and car payments." Their expressions shifted from grief to hope so quickly it was almost comical. "However," I continued, "this gift comes with a contract." I spread the legal documents across the coffee table like a dealer laying out cards. "You'll each sign an agreement, stating that this is the only financial assistance you will ever receive from me. No future requests, no emergency loans, no investment opportunities, no guilt trips about family obligations. This is it." Dad picked up the contract, scanning the legal language. "Victoria, this seems rather extreme. Does it? You've spent 3 months showing me exactly how much my well-being matters to you when you think I can't contribute anything valuable to your lives. This contract simply acknowledges that reality." "We're still family," Mom protested. "Are we?" I asked. "Because family members generally show some concern when other family members are struggling. Family members offer support, not lectures. Family members ask, 'How can I help?' instead of, 'This is probably your own fault.'" Emma was reading through her copy of the contract, and I could see her calculating the dollar amounts. "How much are you giving us?" I told them the specific amounts. Enough to solve their immediate problems, but not enough to change their lifestyles dramatically. Not enough to make them wealthy, but enough to remove the financial stress that had been consuming their conversations for months. "That's it?" Emma asked. "You have $380 million and you're giving us this little?" I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd had in their presence in months. "Emma, 3 hours ago you thought I was broke and selfish. Now you think I'm not giving you enough money. Do you see why I wanted to understand who you really are?" The truth was, the amounts I was offering were generous by any reasonable standard. They were just small relative to my total winnings, which bothered Emma because she'd apparently already started spending my money in her head. "You need to decide right now," I said, checking my watch. "These offers expire when I leave today. Sign the contracts and accept the money with the understanding that this ends our financial relationship forever. Or don't sign, and continue managing your problems yourselves." Dad looked around the room, clearly hoping someone else would make the decision for him. Mom was still crying, but quietly now. Emma was staring at the contract like it might change if she looked at it long enough. The desperation won, exactly as I'd known it would. Emma signed first, her signature sharp and angry. Dad signed next, his hand shaking slightly. Mom signed last, her tears dropping onto the paper. I collected the contracts, placed them back in my portfolio, and stood up. "The money will be transferred tomorrow morning," I said. "You'll each receive confirmation from my lawyer's office." "That's it?" Dad asked. "You're just leaving?" "Yes," I said simply. "I'm leaving." I walked toward the front door, pausing only to look back at them sitting in their living room, surrounded by the legal evidence of what our relationship had actually been worth to them. "For what it's worth," I said, "I hope the money helps you build better lives. I really do." And then I left. No hugs, no promises to stay in touch, no tearful reconciliation where we all acknowledged our mistakes and committed to doing better. I simply left. Walking out of that house felt like stepping out of a burning building, not because I was escaping danger, but because I was finally breathing clean air after years of inhaling smoke. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the house where I'd spent my childhood learning that love was conditional and acceptance was earned through usefulness. The same house where I'd just purchased my freedom from those lessons. My phone buzzed before I'd even reached the end of their street. Emma texting, "This is insane. You can't just cut off your family like this." Then Dad calling, "Victoria, we need to talk about this more. This is all very sudden." Then Mom, voicemail. "Honey, I think we all said things we didn't mean. Can we please try again?" I turned off my phone. The next morning, I confirmed that the money transfers had gone through. Legal documents filed, contracts executed, obligations fulfilled. Clean, final, done. I spent the rest of that week doing something I'd never done before, planning a life based entirely on my own preferences. For 30 years, I'd made decisions through the filter of family expectations. Where to go to school, what to study, where to work, how to spend my free time, even how to feel about my own achievement. Everything had been measured against the impossible standard of earning approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. Now I could make choices based on what actually made me happy. The first decision was where to live. I'd been fantasizing about leaving our area for years, but had always found reasons to stay. Family obligations, job security, familiarity, fear of starting over. None of those reasons applied anymore. I spent hours researching cities I'd always wanted to visit, places with good weather, cultural opportunities, communities of people who chose to be there rather than people who'd never left. I looked at houses that weren't just bigger than my apartment, but fundamentally different. Spaces designed for peace instead of efficiency. Properties with gardens and views and room to breathe. The second decision was about work. I'd been competent at accounting, but I'd never loved it. It was a practical choice, a safe choice, a choice that ensured I could always support myself no matter what happened with my family. I didn't need safety anymore. I could afford to pursue something meaningful. I researched volunteer opportunities with organizations that aligned with my values, educational nonprofits that helped first-generation college students navigate financial aid, financial literacy programs for young adults aging out of foster care, community gardens in urban areas, things I'd never had time for when I was working overtime to prove my worth to people who didn't value what I had to offer anyway. The third decision was about relationships. I'd spent so much energy trying to manage my family's dysfunction that I'd never developed many friendships. I'd dated, but never seriously, partly because I was always emotionally drained from family dynamics, and partly because I'd never felt secure enough in my own worth to believe I deserved genuine partnership. That was going to change. Over the following months, I executed my plan with the same methodical precision I'd used to document my family's failures. I found a house in a small college town 3 states away. Historic, charming, surrounded by trees and far enough from my past to feel like a completely fresh start. I established connections with local volunteer organizations and began building a social life based on shared interests rather than shared DNA. Most importantly, I learned what it felt like to make decisions without having to justify them to people who would disapprove, regardless of what I chose. 2 years later, I woke up in my sun-filled bedroom overlooking a garden I'd planted myself and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt guilty about being happy. My house had become everything I'd dreamed of during those years in my cramped apartment. Spacious but not ostentatious. Comfortable but not wasteful. Every room reflected my actual taste rather than what I thought might gain approval from people whose opinions no longer mattered. I'd found my rhythm in the volunteer work. 3 days a week helping young adults develop financial literacy skills. 1 day a week mentoring first-generation college students. Weekends working in the community garden and exploring my new city. I discovered that helping people who genuinely appreciated the assistance felt completely different from helping people who expected it as their due. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was more generous with my time and money as a millionaire hermit than I'd ever been as a daughter desperately seeking approval. I'd also started dating, carefully, intentionally, with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're worth. Dr. James Mitchell was a psychology professor at the local university, divorced with 2 teenage kids who lived with him half the time. He was kind, funny, intellectually curious, and genuinely interested in my opinions about everything from municipal budgeting to the best hiking trails in the area. When I told him about my lottery win and the family situation, he didn't try to fix it or suggest I owed them forgiveness. He just listened, asked thoughtful questions, and told me he admired how clearly I'd thought through a complicated situation. It was the first time someone had responded to my story with respect instead of judgment. The family contact had dwindled to almost nothing. Mom sent Christmas cards with notes about how much they missed me, but no acknowledgement of why I'd left. Dad occasionally emailed articles about financial planning that he thought I'd find interesting, apparently forgetting that I no longer needed his guidance. Emma had unfriended me on social media after her attempts to maintain contact were met with polite but distant responses. I felt nothing but relief. The strangest part was how normal this life felt. I'd expected winning the lottery to be transformative in obvious ways, but the real transformation had been discovering who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it freely. I still drove practical cars and shopped at regular grocery stores and lived within a reasonable budget. The difference was that my choices were mine. When I decided to spend money on a 3-week photography workshop in Italy, I didn't have to justify it to anyone. When I chose to donate anonymously to scholarship funds, I didn't have to explain my priorities. When I decided to adopt 2 rescue dogs and let them sleep on my expensive couch, no one lectured me about property maintenance. Freedom, I'd learned, wasn't about having unlimited money. It was about having unlimited choice. On quiet evenings, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if my family had responded differently to my fake financial crisis. If they'd offered genuine support, asked thoughtful questions, or simply listened without judgment. Would I have shared the lottery winnings? Would we have found a way to build healthier relationships? Probably not. The lottery had revealed who they were, but it hadn't created those character traits. 30 years of evidence suggested that their conditional love and casual cruelty weren't aberrations caused by stress. They were fundamental features of how they approached relationships. I'd finally learned to stop expecting different results from the same people. The best part of my new life wasn't the money, the house, or even the freedom from family drama. It was waking up every morning knowing that my happiness didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I'd spent 3 decades trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it. Now I was surrounded by people who chose to care about me because they enjoyed my company, not because DNA obligated them to tolerate my existence. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Sometimes the biggest lottery win isn't money. It's discovering you don't need the people who never valued what you had to offer in the first place. As I sat in my garden that morning, coffee in hand and dogs at my feet, I realized the best revenge really was living well. Not because it made my family regret their choices, but because it made their opinions irrelevant to my joy. I'd finally learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich was having money, wealthy was having choices, and the wealthiest I'd ever felt was the day I chose myself over people who'd spent 30 years showing me I wasn't worth choosing. Sometimes you don't win the lottery. Sometimes the lottery wins you.